Cohost, an inside look at California politics and the state legislature. I'm your host, Assemblyman Josh Hoover, and very excited today for a special guest that we have on the show, Graham Dugoni, CEO of Yonder. Yonder, some of you may have heard of it, maybe not. Yonder's mission is to alleviate the intrusion of personal technology to create vital distraction-free experiences that enrich people's lives. The company was founded by Graham in 2014 against the backdrop of the tech boom in San Francisco, California, surrounded by millions of apps, tech conglomerates, and new smart devices encroaching on every facet of modern life. Graham conceived of a simple solution to a very complex problem, and I'll let him talk a little bit more about that. But before we do, I just want to say welcome to the show.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. And, very excited to have you on. Obviously, Yonder is a kind of a company and a concept that I've been very interested in for a long time, working on different pieces of legislation here in the state capital of California. But yeah, tell us a little bit about yourself first, and then we can get into Yonder as well.
Yeah, well, I'm happy to. And congratulations, of course, on your bill.
Absolutely.
It's fantastic.
The Phone Free Schools Act, obviously signed by the governor a couple weeks ago. Mm-hmm. Really something that I hope will help us move the needle on this topic. And, happy to get into that too. So.
Okay, great. Well, yeah, I don't know where to start. I mean,
just tell me about your background and your background, but also what kind of led you to found Yonder in 2014 and kind of the motivation behind that.
Sure. So I was in San Francisco at the time, and before 2014, I grew up. I was a soccer player, so I played in college. I played for a little bit after school in Europe, and but really my interest, and it has been for a long time, and before I started the company, was in sociology and philosophy of technology. That was kind of the rabbit hole I went down for several years. Love it. So I guess I was just looking around at the world around maybe 2011 to 2013, 14. And a lot of the people I was reading at the time, people like Heidegger, Kierkegaard, Marshall McLuhan, people like that, I thought that the proliferation of new digital media, the smartphones, the internet, all these things, they're a radically new tool. They're going to open up a lot of new possibilities in society and for people, but there are also going to be a lot of unforeseen consequences. And when I moved to San Francisco, I think I was surprised because in the tech world, I thought like people were innovating and doing different things, but very few people, if anyone, had read a lot of the foundational thinkers from the last 100 years on a lot of these concepts that still applied to these new tools. So I felt like, as a crossover generation, my generation was probably the last ones to not grow up with a smartphone, not get it till much later.
For sure.
I felt like it was my generation's responsibility to lay down at least an opportunity for this younger generation to experience what the world was like, to walk through the day for 6 or 8 hours a day, particularly in a school, and see the difference between the online world and the physical world around them. So at least as they get older, they could understand the difference between the two, because I knew they'd be born into it.
That's amazing. So just for people that aren't aware of like what Yonder is, so talk to us about how you did that. Like, so what was the kind of origin of the bag, right? This Yonder bag or the pouch, and kind of what was the early iteration of it, and how has it evolved?
Yeah. So the broad concept, I described to you the backdrop, but the manifestation of that is creating phone-free spaces. So we do that in concerts, and we especially do that in schools. We help schools become entirely phone-free spaces. So then the question for me back in 2014 was, well, how would you do that? And remember, in 2014, there was no vernacular around this. No one was talking about the harms of social media, anything. So when I was
if anything, it was being celebrated, right? I mean, the iPhone in 2007 was seen as like a technological marvel, right? Oh, yeah. And then by 2014, it was in everybody's pocket practically. So
with very few questions asked, which is, look, that's how things happen sometimes. They move fast. And so I got laughed out of a lot of rooms and told this will never happen. But to me, the concept I felt was sound. How do we create these phone-free spaces where what happens there stays there, but also where kids especially are going to be free from the detrimental effects of their distractions and bullying, and also the effect on critical thinking and all this other stuff. So I was left with the question, how do I do that? And that's when I thought of the Yonder pouch, what became the Yonder pouch, which was a way to put people's wearable devices in their phone into a pouch. When you close it, it locks. The person keeps that on them, so they're never giving up their phone.
Sure.
But inside this defined space, it's locked, so it's an entirely phone-free space. When they leave that space, whether it's a venue or a school, at the end of the day, the student or the patron at a show taps that pouch on an unlocking mechanism, it pops open, you have access to your phone again.
Sure. Yeah.
So back then, I knew nothing about business and nothing about product design. So I went to the local hardware store in San Francisco and I sewed the first pouches myself.
Wow.
I sourced different components and I cobbled them together. And that's just what I did. That was the first prototypes until I scrounged up some more money and I started sending them overseas to get more samples back. And I just kind of built it brick by brick.
Wow. That's amazing. So what has been the growth of Yonder since 2014? I mean, what have you seen? I mean, obviously California-based company. I'm sure you have a lot of customers in California, but like, what have you seen in terms of growth?
Well, in 2014, again, when I first got over that initial hump of making some things and I started to go around door to door. So I had 500 pouches, let's say, in the back of my car. I would go to see 8 schools in the Bay Area every single day. And then I expanded and would start to go to LA. Yeah. And I would go to 2 or 3 music venues every night, just trying to find someone who would let me try the concept.
Sure.
Eventually, I got in with a club that let me use it for a show and got a little press and then, started working with a few comedians and that part of the business started to take off. So it was really in show business where we got our first notoriety of creating a phone-free show.
Yeah.
But our first customers were actually schools, and they were in the Bay Area down in San Bruno.
Yeah.
And so even in 2014, talking to teachers, I knew that the problem was there, and teachers were experiencing it with students. It's just it wasn't in the general consciousness.
Sure, yeah.
So really, the show side of the business for us became highly visible and kind of started to take off. Schools were growing, but there was a lot we had to figure out about how to support schools correctly. So fast forward to now, post-pandemic, and that has really switched where now we've grown across all parts of the business, but schools are by far the largest and most important part of what we do.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
How many are you in schools outside of California at this point, or are you mostly still operating within California?
Oh, no, we're in all 50 states and we're in 30 different countries.
That's amazing.
So we're all over at this point. Yeah, there are millions of students that use
Yonder
every day.
So you've got students across the world right now that are using Yonder pouches.
Yeah, it's part of their daily routine.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
What's been some of the feedback you've received from like teachers and principals or even students and parents?
Oh, it depends what year you ask, honestly. It's really changed. The zeitgeist has changed. The dialogue has changed so much. It's impossible for me to capture how different it is.
Yeah.
From the beginning, I would say teachers understood the problem and were grateful because they've been wrestling. Most teachers everywhere, they're in the same position, whether they're in Norway, they're in the UK, they're in California.
Yeah.
They're in the position of being the phone police. And they're having those negative interactions with students all throughout the day, right?
Right.
So the Yonder program, what the Yonder program has become, because again, we don't just ship pouches to schools when we work with them. Sure. What we do is we come in, we help with the policy creation, the staff training, the communication plan, and also the actual rollout. Yeah. And that includes engaging students in the conversation. So when we go in, what we hear from students is usually a bit of reluctance at first, and then begrudgingly, a few weeks later or a month later, they admit they're happier. Yeah. They admit that they're making more friends, they're less distracted.
That's awesome.
And also for me, very importantly, they're less anxious because, you can kind of like anything related to mental health, you can deal with the symptoms, which are important, but a lot of these things are coming through the phone, and it's not just distractions, it's actually fear of being video recorded and posted online and all these existential problems. So that's students. Teachers, it's a tremendous help to teachers because now you've pulled the policy forward to the front of the school building rather than fighting a million little battles throughout the day. Mm-hmm. You've made something really explicit and created structure around a really nebulous big problem. And from parents, the number one thing we hear is they start to notice a change in their student outside of school. Wow. That the habit of their phone being in their hand constantly starts to kind of disintegrate and the phone starts to appear in another room or further from them, which makes sense. It's like any habit. So that's generally what we hear.
Yeah. So like on that point, like with the habit, formation and things like that. I mean, one of the great things I think for implementing this policy in schools is that you're really interrupting, right, that habit. Do you feel that, I know there's some research out there too, but do you feel that phones are kind of addictive and like designed to be addictive? And do you buy into this notion that they really are? It is almost like breaking an addiction especially for young people.
Well, look, I think that when I first moved to San Francisco, I read all the white papers coming out of the tech world. So it's no secret how apps are designed and and how that works. I think we're super visual animals, and it's a very visual stimuli.
Right.
And also a lot of aspects of social media or the internet in general, they scratch at an itch that is very fundamentally like a human need, the need for connection, for shared experiences. The issue with the online world, when people spend too much time in it, I think, is that it's a simulation. It scratches at that itch, but there's not enough substance to sustain us.
Yeah.
And I think that's what people feel of all ages, older and younger kids. So when we create a phone-free school, the objective, and I think what happens is you create enough space for young people especially, but for anybody, to again experience the difference between the online world and the physical world. And that in turn gives you space to form new habits around it. And that's why very early on, look, when I started the company in 2014, it was, and then moving to maybe 2016, 17, there started to be discussions about a phone ban. I was very conscious from the beginning to call what we did phone-free schools.
Sure.
We created phone-free schools because it's not a punitive thing. It's giving people the opportunity to experience something that they're not experiencing in their daily life. And that, 100%. I think the way you frame it and the way you approach it, not just for young people, but for communities, is incredibly important.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more on that point, actually. And I really appreciate you bringing that up, because it was so funny. Nowhere in my legislation does it talk about banning phones, right? It's like, so the Phone Free Schools Act, AB 3216, kind of the basis of it is, schools do have the flexibility to prohibit, smartphones in certain contexts or limit them in certain contexts based on how they see fit. But it's funny because, and we actually called it the Phone Free Schools Act, not like the Phone Ban Act, right? But it's kind of funny because the media tends to pick it up as a ban. Like, they love to use the word ban. And so like you're seeing all these articles, like when I introduced the bill, like, we're going to ban phones in schools. And then we got more of a negative reaction from that than, like, I think, to your point, what we're actually trying to accomplish, which is, really just creating sensible restrictions around, when you're using the phone. So.
Yeah. And I think the thing that we've learned, again, over 10 years of doing this all around the world is when you see something at a high level labeled as a ban or something, if you really want to create a phone-free school or district, in that space for students, the devil's kind of in the details. And what we've learned is that the reason we engage at all levels when we work with the district and we don't just ship them product is we found you have to engage the entire community. It affects parents, students, teachers, staff, administrators. You have to get everyone on board. So when a district comes to us and says, let's say it's a couple weeks before back to school, and they say, hey, we'd love 20,000 pouches. Can you have them here in 2 weeks? Our response is, that's amazing. But hold on a second. Have you thought of this? Have you thought of this? Have you thought of this? That's what we've learned. It's like a campaign. You have to kind of do that. Like any new policy, if you want it to have teeth and really help people on the ground, that's what you have to do. So that's what we've learned.
No, that's brilliant. And like, you have to develop a culture, right, at the school. And then you also have to, in some ways, get buy-in, right?
You have to.
And obviously students, I've noticed, like, at least the students I've talked to, and I've met with some student leaders on this topic specifically, they do tend to initially be more resistant. But I think, to your point earlier, like, when you actually dive in and ask them, about phone use, they will acknowledge that it's probably a little beyond what it should be, even among their own peers, right? And so, but to establish that buy-in and that understanding through policies, that's one of the things I've really appreciated about what your guys' approaches have been. And not every school district is even using Yonder pouches. Some of them are using just other policies to try to limit it. But I think that it really does help. And so in the school district I came from, they've been implementing this in their middle schools, and they found it to be really helpful. There's always some challenges on implementation, but at the end of the day, over time, most of the kids just accept it as a policy and then actually start to see the benefits of it, you know.
And that's
So,
our goal, is to
yeah.
help kids and teachers facilitate that culture change you just talked about. Because what we find is that once you kind of take that out of the equation, it's amazing to see what happens in the space you've created.
Yeah. Oh, for sure.
We see a radical reduction in disciplinary issues and fights.
Hmm.
We see test scores improve. We hear stories about students checking out, or libraries having more books checked out in a week than they had the
That's
entire
incredible.
previous year. So it's kind of that, to me, the bigger philosophical question is like,
Yeah.
when new technology or the phone comes in, what does it displace? Because it has to displace something. And so the goal is,
Correct.
in an educational setting, what do we need to carve out? Not saying anti-technology or anything like that,
Sure.
but just carving out spaces where kids can kind of be kids, and they can
Totally.
relate to each other and all those natural things.
Well, when you look at the Gallup numbers about social media and about how American teenagers, for example, are spending 5 hours per day on social media apps alone, I think that's displacing some serious things, right? I mean, it's obviously displacing academic opportunities. It's certainly displacing real human interaction if you're communicating through social media. And so, yeah, again, not anti-technology, but that is a concerning statistic. When I read that, I was like kind of blown away.
Well,
So,
definitely. I mean, uh, another way to look at it is, in the 10 or 15 years since we've had a lot of these new tools, have people changed, or have the tools we use changed?
yeah,
And that's a point of departure. And
yeah,
it's not to say the internet or those things are going away. Of course, young people, we all have to learn how to work with them and explore their possibilities. But also, we should take stock of what's good that's happening, and
yeah.
what's the negative effects, and try to create some parameters around that. And my sense has been for a long time, and it's definitely changed positively in the last 2 or 3 years, is young people know that something is up with the way they're kind of,
Yeah.
with constant internet access. And when you kind of create the space for them, they kind of genuinely will tell you it feels better.
That's amazing. Yeah, that's. I think that might be the biggest thing. How has been? What's the reaction been in other countries? Like, how would you say, compare to like the situation? I guess you could call it a problem, but really the situation in the United States. Have other countries been more willing to adopt this, or less willing, or like, yeah, how does it compare?
It's been fascinating for us to watch,
Yeah.
because certain countries in Europe, I would say, were a little earlier to the question.
Hmm.
Um, the culturally, everywhere is different. Their
Sure.
politics are a little different. Civil society is a little bit different. One thing that is constant is the issues related to phone use. We've seen this
Wow.
everywhere.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter, honestly, where you go. The same things are happening. So that's a constant. The way governments and people approach it is a little different. I would say, if you had asked that question a couple of years ago, I would say some countries in Western Europe might have been further ahead than the US. But as of, honestly, maybe a year to 6 months ago, I would say a lot of states and districts now in the US have zoomed ahead to now, from our perspective, be right at the front of actually dealing with this issue, because they're going a step further than labeling something as a ban. And they're actually trying to push a layer deeper and go, well, what do our teachers need to support them?
Yeah.
How do we actually make this effective for them on the ground? Whereas other countries, I think, are stuck at that one level below of kind of saying, we need to do something, but what do we do?
Yeah.
That's what I've seen. But
Awesome.
the consistent aspect across all of it is kind of fascinating, but it's there.
That's incredible. Yeah, and I actually have heard from teachers on both sides of this topic, actually, kind of for the phone free policy and against the phone free policy. And it's actually been interesting to talk to them, because most of them do acknowledge that phones can be a problem. And I think their big fear in a lot of cases is, not, to your point earlier, not wanting to be the phone police. And I think in some ways, at least what we've seen in my district, when we've implemented these policies, is those fears go away pretty quickly, because that kind of culture that is created as you described, and the general policy is really more of a backup for them. And so it's not something that they have to fight with the kid about, because they can just blame the state, or they can blame the district, or they can blame the policy or the administration, and then administration can respond to that quickly, right? And so I think that is probably one of the biggest challenges with implementation for sure, is getting the teachers buy-in too.
Yeah, you have to let teachers know that this is not going to add to their workload, that this is something that becomes part of the daily ritual where students walk up, at the beginning of the school day, they have their pouch, their wearable tech, and their phone goes in, and they move on. And then if you see a phone, which inevitably you will see one or two or whatever inside the school, it's very clear what happens next. It's not if this, then that.
Sure.
And also parents know what the expectation is, because all that work has been done on the upfront, on the launch. And that's what sets the stage for that structure to permeate the culture. And like you said, for students who might want to push back, to then realize, well, I can still have my phone on me. I have that, responsibility. I have that on me. My phone's not separated from me. And, oh, hey, maybe I kind of like this.
Yeah.
But it takes that kind of structure and pre-planning to do it.
For sure. Well, I'll need to dust off my Heidegger, because I definitely did read some of that too back in college. But what are some of I know he wrote a lot about technology, but what are some of the I guess deeper influences for you? I know you mentioned up at the front that like the philosophical influences that really kind of got you to your worldview.
Well, yeah, that's a good question. It's a lot. There's a lot of people. There are a lot of important thinkers, and then combined for me personally with just a lot of observation, going to a lot of shows and seeing how people interact with the world around them. But I guess I would say, to me, between all those different thinkers, there's a theme to things, and I think that the more technology that comes into people's lives, the goal of most technology is to make things cheaper, easier, faster, and more available all the time. That's basically the thrust of it. I think that's really valuable in some aspects of life, and in others, I think it has a way of running roughshod over things that are really important to people. Because if you ask anyone, if I asked you, for instance, what you enjoy doing most in life, and then I asked you to apply the idea of making it cheaper, easier, faster, does that enhance the thing you're thinking about? Does it make it better? Does it even make sense? Yeah. So for most people, those things that they enjoy doing the most, they're not affected by the spirit that animates a lot of technology. They're things that are bound up in the process itself, like whether you're cooking or you're biking or you're learning or playing an instrument. The process is kind of the thing. And so I guess that's kind of my worldview, is how in civil society, in our society, how do we try to pick out the things that are helpful to us and also box in a little bit some of the negative things to try to enhance what we really value. It's a really hard thing to do, and I don't think anyone can fully move the needle. But I think there's glimpses we can offer people that help them in their individual lives. No,
it makes sense. What is your general, on that topic, I think it's companies such as, and I'm not here to bash anyone. I'm just curious about your particular thoughts, but companies like Meta, right, have invested significant resources, not only in things like AI, but really in the metaverse, just this idea of a digital world. And I think are kind of banking on this idea that it's going to continue to grow and expand, and more things will go online and more things will go digital. What are your thoughts on that as just, I guess, whether that's a positive development or even, what are some of the things that we should be thinking about in the future of technology?
Well, I don't know. I think that's an interesting trend to look at. Are things headed that way, or are things headed another direction? I sense maybe that they're headed, not that those things are going to go away. I think they're going to exist, and people find, some people want to go to those places and find value in them. And but in general, I think that this younger generation and people, not just the younger generation, people in general are looking for things that are authentic and real. And in general, those are usually embodied. It's your physical person. So, I mean, that's a overriding, I think, paradigm in Silicon Valley when I lived there for 8 years, and probably still now, is this idea that everything is going to become more connected everywhere all the time, and that will lead us to some tech utopia. I think if you look around at what's happening, that's probably not the case, and there's a push. There's maybe a push another direction. But that's my own, personal sense of things and what I see, and I think what still draws people to live performances and to sporting events and these things. They're things that can't be captured or boxed up or simulated. You You have to be there to do it. And I think I'd put learning mostly in that bucket as well. Although there are certainly other tools that can augment and help and do things, and I understand that.
For sure. Yeah. What were your, this is totally off topic, but I was just curious, you know, I don't know if it was Tesla, but Elon Musk had his big announcement recently on, you know, like different like robo taxis and like I think autonomous vehicle technology, for example, is one of those areas of technology where you could absolutely see catching on at some point as the technology improves and actually in some ways saving lives, right? Because in theory, you'd have you know, more safer modes of transportation than human operators, for example. But you know, this now I'm going to forget the name of it because this is just off the cuff. But this robot that he had unveiled that's going to do all your daily chores and all this stuff. But what are your general thoughts on that, just for fun? Pick your brain about, because I kind of find that interesting and also a bit creepy and a bit iRobot and a bit like. But also kind of interesting conceptually, like, are you going to have like this sort of technological presence in your home someday? So,
yeah, well, it's already, I mean, with things like Alexa or whatever, people are already making some of those decisions in their house. But look, I think for some of the automated driving and stuff like that, I know less about it than some people. The biggest question that always pops up to me is what's going to happen in terms of just labor and automation. Sure. You know, it's more of a political and economic question, and where is that going to put us down the road? And I think everyone is thinking about that in all industries. Is that going to be, I can see how it's beneficial. I can see how it's more capital efficient. I can see how it's good in some ways. I can also see it creating some real issues. But again, I'm not an expert in that. I've personally never quite understood why people are so into the self-driving cars, but it's a thing. Yeah. But in general, I think, you know, with more automation and things being done for you, it's a fine line, because it helps, but also I think it has the potential to turn people into jelly. You know, if you think about, I'm not convinced that critical thinking is like a native faculty, and it has to be developed and flexed, especially for young people. That's the point of education, is to develop that. And it takes sustained attention and, you know, your mind's eye being fixated on something. And if you look at, you know, the way a lot of digital tools operate, I think data retrieval is different than critical thinking faculties. And so again, it's a paradigm thing. It's like, you know, you can be more efficient and get more things done, but, you know, is the view from the top of the mountain the same if you rode a gondola there versus you hiked? You know, do you know something truly if you didn't have to go through the longer steps to build your foundational structure of knowledge? I'm not sure. Yeah. You know, but at the same time, the stream is moving, the world is moving, the genie's not going back in the bottle. So
that's a good point.
You know, they're big questions. I think they're ultimately for every person to decide how they feel and how they affect the things they value. I think maybe that's the point.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. So what is the what was like some of the first comedy shows that you guys or even, I know you said early on it was a lot of like show business stuff. So what were some of the early adopters? Like, who were some of the first folks to actually give this a shot?
Oh, I think the first one was a biker bar in Oakland.
Nice.
And I did a show and, you know, did it for free. And it was basically still, you know, versions of my hand-sewn pouches at the time. And I didn't know how to message it. There was no vernacular, and the people weren't happy to do it. So it was kind of a disaster. I had people ripping it up and yelling at me and stuff, and I was like, well, you know, that was interesting.
It's a learning process.
It was a learning process, let me tell you. But after that, I think, you know, the first kind of meaningful shows we did were probably with Chappelle when he came back, and that was kind of a big break for us. Yeah. But even so, it was all being figured out, because I was, you know, a friend of mine and myself went out there to Chicago and were pouching people, and how to talk to people about the issue. How did you get people to give up and hand you their phone so you could put it in a pouch and hand it back? You had to be really creative. So we would say things like, you know, hey, is your phone on vibrate or silent? And they'd say, oh yeah. And you'd say, okay, great. We'll take that. We'll see that. But you had to kind of coax it out of people. Yeah. Where, you know, now it's very different because people kind of know the drill and it's socially understood. But the same was true in schools. I mean, our team, we had people, one person in particular on our team named Benji, who was out in New York City, you know, 8 years ago on the ground in these schools, helping create a culture that there was no name for. And working with these hand in hand with these teachers, and kind of in these really just crazy setups sometimes, really, really in the weeds, helping them build that foundational infrastructure. So we had a lot of trial and error. We had people come to us early, a lot of teachers who said, I'd like to use Yonder for my classroom. We said, okay, we'll help you do that. And we learned really quickly that didn't work, because the things we talked about earlier, you've now created a thing where it's at the level of classroom management, and students are still on their phone in passing period, and all those issues are still there. So all these things we learned over working with our customers, honestly, and always by having our people on the ground, which is a huge thing. It's part of the ethos of our company, is we do as much as we possibly can to be in person, on the ground with the people we work with, because look, that's the type of that's what we do.
Yeah, that's incredible. So what was the, I guess, motivation for someone like Dave Chappelle? I mean, because obviously you have the phone-free schools benefit, or I'm sorry, the phone-free spaces benefit, right, of kind of the general question of limiting that technology in certain contexts. But for the comedians, did you have to sell them? Was it more of a like, hey, your content will stay more privatized, or there will be fewer leaks and fewer things? Like, was that more of a selling point for them at the start of it, to get you to kind of buy in, or did he have other like reasons for wanting to do it?
Well, I would never try to put words in any of our any of the artists that we work with in their mouths, because we're very fortunate that we work with some amazing artists like Dave Chappelle, Jack White's, the Bob Dylans, and the Joe Rogans, and all these different types of artists, comedy and music. And Broadway. So in a way, what I've learned over time is that all these artists come to it from a slightly different angle. For some, there's an element of privacy, for sure. For the majority that I've spoken with over the years, it's just that it makes the show better. It's that people, you imagine Madison Square Garden and 20,000 people walk in and everyone's phone goes in a pouch, and you step into that space and imagine no one's sending out texts, no one's emailing their boss, the last thing of the day. Everyone is locked in, and they're talking at the concession stand, they're getting ready. And then when the curtain comes up and people go in for the performance, the energy in the room is different, and the artist feels that more than anybody. And that's always been the basic goal, is it just makes the show more fun. And that's what we hear. Look, you're always going to have a couple disgruntled people at the end or at the beginning of fans coming in, but the vast majority, even in 2014, would come out saying, that was the best show I've gone to in so long. That was so fun. The energy was amazing. And that's always been our goal, is just to let people make their own association with what it is for them, but to open up the gap, because it's so hard if you don't have something that creates a little bit of a healthy barrier,
Well, and there's something to being immersed in a shared experience, right?
Exactly. Without
other distractions. And I hadn't really thought of it from that perspective, so that's pretty cool. It's so funny too. I always think about this in the terms of like all these streaming options that we have now. You've got like Netflix has been around forever, but there's now a million different Netflixes, right? Or Netflix like options, and to the point where I feel like we used to be in a place where a lot of us would like watch the same shows, and now there's so many options, and there's just so much content out there that even as a culture, we have fewer kind of shared experiences in that way too. And I think it's just really interesting that as like, the market has grown and options have grown, like some of that, there's obviously benefits, but in some ways too, it's like there's less to connect about, like over your water cooler, for example, or whatever. I find it interesting.
I think you're dead on that. The fragmentation is kind of full of possibility, like everything, full of possibilities, but there are these hidden like paralysis that can creep into things. I see it in a lot of different manifestations too.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. So what has been the most, I guess, fun thing about like doing what you do, obviously working, running Yonder, but just like what has been your most like rewarding experience so far, and kind of like what do you enjoy the most?
Oh, I'm lucky. There's a lot of things. There's a lot. I get to go to a lot of shows, which is incredible. Awesome, all over the country and around the world. And I get to meet a ton of just fascinating people and educators in all different parts of the country who are all doing kind of amazing things. So honestly, it's a cross between all of those things, and also our company itself, just the type of people we attract. We have a ton of former educators. We have people from the music industry, from the outdoor world. Like, we have a very unique, I think, group of people who are highly just motivated and passionate about what we do. But probably the most motivating thing is either being in one of those spaces and seeing the transformational effect that happens. Like, I've talked to principals, in New York City, who have said that they were about to leave the profession, and then Yonder came in, and now they're going to stay because it's transformed their relationship with their students. And, it's kind of, in a way, slightly put the genie back in the bottle where they were ready to throw their hands up. Or, to go to a show and look around at a crowd of 20,000 people and not to see a single blinking light. Yeah. And to see that's a difficult experience to get unless you go out in the wilderness these days.
So true.
So, or to go to a concession stand and hear two people talking about how they're talking because they're not on their phones. To me, that's the kind of societal impact that I've always hoped for. And when you see it happening on the ground, you see kids talking and interacting in a way and kind of coming to it, that's deeply fulfilling for me.
That's awesome. Yeah, no, it's that's pretty amazing too, to think about seeing those large groups of people, or even classrooms of people, focused on their studies or focused on that experience, and not being distracted by what has now become kind of just such a regular part of our everyday lives with our phones, right? So,
well, yeah, because also I think it's there's maybe a little misconception that sometimes people have where, let's say you're in a big crowd or something, and someone pulls out a phone to send a text, and then they come back to what they're doing.
Yeah.
If you amplify that over thousands of people, or in a school setting, over hundreds of kids, you're not really coming back to the same situation you just left before you went to take a photograph or thing. It kind of changes the dynamic, because what's implicitly being said is this situation is not enough. So you send out a thought wave, and it doesn't come back really. And so when you build that out, it's like a wave, when you build that out, the whole conditions of the culture or the atmosphere, the environment change. And when you bottle it up and that's not happening, it's amazing to see how different the outcome can be. So in a school setting, it can be the interpersonal relationships, it can be the social dynamics, it can be sports being played versus kids scrolling at lunch. In a show setting, it can just be the kind of the fever pitch that's allowed to be attained, versus a slow drain of the energy out of the room. So that's again, back to the tech themes, I think it's this idea of, can you really live something and capture it at the same time? Can you broadcast it and live it? I'm skeptical. I think you're kind of doing something, or you're not doing
something.
Yeah.
That's a great point. Well, before we get you out of here, I guess my last question would be, you kind of mentioned at the beginning of all of this that when you started all this, like, you kind of were just jumping into something that you had a goal in mind, right? But you didn't totally know exactly where it was going to go or how to do it. Coming from that point in like 2013, 2014 to now, I guess how big, like, for example, is Yonder now in terms of employees, and like what kind of reach do you guys have? I know you mentioned you're in a lot of different countries, but what's it been like for you just growing as a leader, and what's your take on managing that sort of operation now compared to like when it started, and what are some of the lessons you've learned from that perspective that you would share with other people?
Well, that's a good question. There's a lot in that. I'll try to.
I know. Sorry, it's a big question.
No,
so you can answer it however you want.
Yeah, no, it's good. Back in 2014 when I was starting again, I felt like things were maybe headed this direction. When I look back now from where we are and seeing an act that moves an entire state in such a positive direction, it's incredible. It's everything that I was hoping that society would start to do, and it's incredible to see. My own journey, I guess, has been just trial and error. My hypothesis from the beginning was I knew nothing about business. I knew nothing about product. And I was driving around in my 1978 Toyota Dolphin van up and down the coast with 500 pouches. But I was determined to do one thing, which is I was going to learn by doing it myself. I was going to make mistakes, learn by doing it. And that's basically still what I'm doing. Now
Yeah.
I'm surrounded by a lot of really capable people who have skills that I don't have.
Yeah.
But that's still the thing that I try to do, is to go out and actually see what's happening, ask people, what are they thinking? What are they doing? What do they think about Yonder? How can we improve? Like, that's the fundamental formula is the same. But yeah, I think the positive response that we're now getting is so different to 2014 that it's
totally agree.
It honestly feels like another life to me.
I feel like it's changed dramatically. Even since like, 20, like pre-pandemic, like 2019, I think we've seen a huge shift. And maybe in some weird way, that's partially because we were all forced online so much for 3 years or 2 years or whatever the pandemic was, where everything became on Zoom and everything became do it from home. 100%. And it almost was like an oversaturation of that lifestyle, right?
I think that's exactly what happened because right, leading up to the pandemic, we were growing a lot as a company, but then the pandemic hit and schools shut down, shows shut down, so we were we just kind of struggled and made it through.
It's incredible. Yeah.
But on the back end of that, I saw exactly what you said. I think you're spot on. I think people became so much more aware of it, whether it's parents seeing their kid and going, wait, this is what it's like to spend 6 or 8 hours a day online. I'm watching this. Okay. And then in themselves seeing its effect, because that's one other thing I've seen over 10 years has been there's a sense that maybe technology affects young people more or differently than adults. And in some ways that could be true. But in general, I don't think it's true. I think technology affects everybody. And I see it in older people. I see it in young kids. Yeah. The only difference is maybe older people's worldview is more set, Sure. Yeah. But the patterns of behavior, their body language, all that stuff morphs along with the medium. So, yeah.
That's so interesting. Well, I just want to say, I guess thank you to Yonder for the work you're doing, because I think, in a lot of ways, this is kind of an interesting trajectory. In like 06, 07, you had companies, right? The free market, a company in the free market develop a product like the iPhone, which was in a lot of ways revolutionary, connected people in ways that they've never been connected before. And prior to that, it was just like text messaging and phone calls. But now, being able to connect online from your pocket, like just really incredible technological advance. Then we saw like the harms that were potentially created for it, not even by the company that created the phone, but maybe by some of the developers that were creating apps for the phone. And I think, as you said earlier, a lot of unintended consequences or unforeseen consequences of that. And then a company like Yonder coming in and actually, from a free market standpoint, solving that problem in a lot of ways, or at least attempting to solve that problem and mitigate those challenges. I think it's an incredible kind of journey and an incredible story, because I hate to say it, but I'm not sure that without all of the work that you did and Yonder did in those years leading up to today, that we would have the movement that we currently have when it comes to phone-free schools and phone-free spaces. I really feel like when I started pushing so I was on a school board prior to being in the assembly, and this was back in 2019 when I was really trying to push phone-free schools in my school district, like on a much smaller level, right? And I got a lot of resistance. I mean, this was obviously pre-pandemic. We got it done, and we did I would say a baby step policy at that point in time where we prohibited them in elementary schools. That was kind of where it seemed acceptable to prohibit them, because most elementary parents and teachers and principals were like, well, I don't think our elementary school kids really need access to their smartphones. But then like you got a lot of pushback from the secondary, kind of level. Like, is it feasible? Do kids, are they going to feel left out or missing something in some way? And then fast forward to 2024 when we introduced the Phone Free Schools Act and tried to do it statewide. I mean, the level of support for it was just so much more substantial. And I think, to your point, like maybe some of that was assisted by the pandemic. But at the end of the day, I think it was also like the work that Yonder's been doing for a number of years on just getting this message out there and communicating to people that this is a possibility, right?
Yeah.
You can actually do this successfully, and like kind of, I guess, unknowingly or actually knowingly training people already to use the pouches, right, at different shows and different venues and things like that. I did think it got into the general consciousness in a way that I think was really helpful to us this year in passing the bill. So
wow,
awesome.
I really appreciate you saying that. You're the first person I've talked to who's, I think, spoken about it that way. And I appreciate it, because I think you've made a lot of people at our company. It's been thousands and tens of thousands of conversations. It's impossible to describe at these board meetings or at these parent-teacher nights across the country, talking to communities about it. And like you said, it can be done, and here's how you do it, and answering questions. It's taken that over so many years, I think, to develop that sense of, oh, this is a possibility. So I really appreciate you saying that, I think.
No, absolutely. And I'm excited. I'm excited that you were able to come on today and talk more about it. I think that it really does help put into context some of these things that we've been talking about for like over a year now on the legislation and all of that stuff. Any final thoughts that you wanted to share before we close it out?
No, I think, look, this has been really enjoyable for me. You asked tremendous questions, and I've really enjoyed it.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate it. Is there a way to like connect with Yonder, I guess, in any way? Like, is there a place that I should direct people to for if they want to learn more about Yonder?
Sure, of course. Yeah, our website is overyonder.com. And that's it. We don't have any social media, so
over Yonder. That's actually that's a great way to close it. Actually, that's really good. Yeah. I love that. That's awesome. So overyonder.com, and Yonder spelled Yondr. Is that correct? So overyonder.com. So if you want to learn more about Yonder and the work that they're doing, please feel free to check it out. Overyonder.com. Graham, it's just been incredible to talk to you. I'm really excited that you were able to come on the show, and thanks for really, sharing some of your background with our listeners and kind of your mission with our listeners. I really appreciate it and wish the best of luck to you.
Thank you so much.
All right. Have a good one.
All right.